afternoon, everybody. First of all, thank you to be here because it's not only afternoon and after lunch, but it's also pretty freezing here. So it's a great effort that you're making. No, I'm just kidding. So I was here at the previous conference and I spoke about another topic, always in the same panel, the link between contract and litigation. And in that occasion, I spoke about the balance of need between having a long and completely in detail contract and the important need of the business of speed up the process of concluding a contractual negotiation. I was thinking from an in-house counsel perspective, and we often face this challenge to balance the need. In this case, I decided instead to try to discuss about from another angle, from another point of view, and discuss about how, and also if, in your opinion, that can be true or not. So I'm very open to any discussion that you might want to have, even if you disagree, if in your experience, for example, you don't find that what I'm saying is applicable. I will be very happy to have also a discussion after that. So I decided to focus more on cultural differences and see if and how they can play a role in the link between contract and litigation. As Mumtaz said, I used to be an in-house counsel, and I've been in-house, well, actually, I was, because I'm still having difficulties to consider myself as an external lawyer, because I recently opened my private practice, but for more than 12 years, I was in-house. So I kind of still remember very fresh the memory of discussion with other colleagues from different departments, sales department, IT, and other departments on the importance of doing certain things, not doing other things. So when we look at the key factor of during negotiation, what do we think of? I thought about indicating the first 3 or 4 that in my view are pretty generally applicable. So the early involvement from the business. What I used to say always to my colleagues when I was in-house was, please don't call me the night before you need to sign a contract and expect that I can do something for you, because it's very difficult. And if I can do something, most likely would be the results will be not so good, because I haven't had the time to prepare, to understand what you need, what the company needs. So in my view, it's very important that an in-house counsel trains his partner, the people that work in the company, in order to be involved at the earliest stage. Then the second thing, in my view, is a rapid analysis of the business need. What I mean is trying to understand what are we talking about. What type of contract is that? What's the purpose? What's the value? A combination of elements, not just the value, because that's one of the elements, but it's not the only one. The product or services or both, and trying to understand rapidly, because as we know, a lot of time, we don't have so much time as we wish to review things, so we need to be prepared to do a rapid analysis. And then, of course, try to spot which are the crucial provision for that agreement. Very important, because sometimes we think that every provision is crucial at the same time and in the same way. That's not true, and not true also because it depends which business are we in, which are, again, the product or the service that are involved, or where is the location, the length of the contract, a lot of things. So in my view, we need to also make sure that we understand which are the crucial points specifically for that situation, for that agreement, and the so-called non-negotiable points that normally we have in mind when we start a negotiation. And in my view, if we do such a first analysis of all this point, we end up with a pretty good, let's say, analysis of the key factor. But I want to ask you a question. Do we consider cultural differences when we start or we prepare for a negotiation. And if somebody wants to answer to this question, and I'm very happy also to hear if you have ever considered, if you consider normally, if you consider only in certain occasion, if you don't think it's important to consider that. So anybody wants to answer to that question? Yes?
Actually, yes, because we do business globally, and it makes a huge difference if you're, for example, negotiating with Japanese, which is sort of a different dynamic than if you're negotiating with people from the UK or continental Europe. So whenever there is sort of a negotiation going on with, it sounds maybe a little bit nice, but from a European point of view, more exotic countries like Japan, I do prep management for sort of how to approach the negotiations and what to do and what don't to do.
Okay, thank you. Somebody else wants to add anything to that? Either agree or disagree or have a different view? No? Okay. Well, in case you can add also at the end of the presentation if you have other points of view. What I wanted to say is first, what are cultural differences? Actually, first of all, let's say why should we consider that? You mentioned that when you have a cross-border negotiation, you try to be careful on where are you discussing, who you're discussing with. So the first, in my view, the first answer is yes, true. It's easy to say we are discussing with a customer, for example, that is from Japan. It's pretty easy. If we are European or if we are from another country, we know that might be some differences. But my first point is, in my view, they can have an impact also when we don't expect to. Let's make an example. We're having a negotiation with the company that is from our same country, okay? What could happen? First of all, we are in a globalized world, and we don't know who we're negotiating with. So a company from our same country, whatever country we are, can have another lawyer, depending if we are discussing just between lawyers or if there is a bigger first negotiation round with sales department, purchasing department, and lawyers, depending on the case. But anyway, if our counterpart is located in that country but is from another country, what could happen? Well, this could be a consideration that, in my view, can be useful because we don't know upfront all the time if actually somebody may come from another country, may come from another situation. And I said in the same country, in the same company, or in the same office. Now, of course, if we're talking about negotiation, most likely we're talking because we need to decide how to approach the counterparty. But don't forget that sometimes we can have the same issue or the same situation also with our colleagues. We are preparing for a negotiation. We're discussing with our sales department, and the person, for example, the lead our sales department or somebody that we have to work with is from another country. And this could be definitely something that may impact, even when we don't consider, because we tend to sometimes approach the matter as, okay, do I have a negotiation with a Japanese company, a Chinese company, an African company, if I'm talking, for example, from a European perspective, or vice versa. From an African perspective, this could be the same reverse. Am I having a discussion with an European client, an American client, or so forth? But we can have the same exact issue internally. So first of all, in my view, let's think broadly and not underestimate that we can have cultural difference even in-house, meaning even in the same company and even in the same country. First point from my side. What can we consider cultural difference? And actually here I said cultural difference, but I want to say difference generally speaking, because inside I put some cultural difference and some geographical and other type of difference. So for example, when we have to set up a meeting, conference call, face-to-face meeting, no matter which type, do we consider the difference in, for example, timing? Do we consider that if we call the States from Europe in the morning, most likely we are calling in the middle of the night? And the majority of the answer is yes, of course, I know that. Okay, do we consider the days in which they work or they don't work? How many people work in Dubai and happen to be on calls on Fridays? How many people, vice versa, working in Europe happens to be on call on Sundays because they have to talk with people from Dubai? So it's not a right or wrong situation. It's just being at least aware that if you're calling somebody in Dubai on a Friday, well, you're ruining their weekend. And at least, let's put it on the table that that person is being nice and available on a day that is supposed to, at least theoretically, not work. And do you call somebody on Thanksgiving Day in New York? Well, I'm, of course, making examples that are pretty obvious, but sometimes it's not so obvious when we, for example, are talking about festivities that are not belonging to our tradition, for example, either cultural tradition or religious tradition. And as a sign of respect, in my view, is always useful to pay attention to that. So, again, I said timing, meaning different zone, different type of festivity and holidays, but also going more towards the cultural difference, I wrote down the three typical communication channels: the verbal, the paraverbal, and the nonverbal. What do I mean by that? The verbal, so the words that we use and how we construct a sentence. That might be very different. For example, in Italian, we have normally very long sentences that are, especially when we write, very different from an English standard. And there might be some issues in understanding each other, because if you read an email written from somebody that, for example, tried to translate from Italian to English, you will end up with a sentence like this without, most likely, maybe with one comma or semicolon, but the rest is all a sentence that an American or an English person can say, what do you exactly want to say here? Because I was lost 5 sentences ago. So how we write again, or the words or the construction we use, that's the verbal. The paraverbal and the nonverbal are probably something that we all know that exists, but I'm not so sure if we consider all the time. What I mean exactly? Well, so the paraverbal is basically the tone we use, the voice, the speed of the words that we use, and so the way in which we pronounce the words that are the typical verbal. And the nonverbal is everything else, so the way in which we act, the way in which we, for example, we talk with our hands. As a typical saying in Italian, we tend to talk with our hands. The way in which we use the space, very close, very far away. Are we invading the space of somebody? What can be considered an invasion of the space? Or touching somebody, what in some culture could be considered perfectly fine. Tapping on the shoulder in some other culture can be considered absolutely rude. So this goes on the non-verbal. And then we have the big customs and habits that we could say here probably 2 or 3 days just to talk about that. And I don't want to go into the details, but the custom and habits could be pretty much everything from the way in which we have a conversation. Do we normally sit in a certain position? Do we allow certain things? Are we having lunch, and do we normally serve water to women on the table? That's something that in some culture is considered courtesy, and some other culture may be considered actually weird if you don't know that person. And this is just an example, but we can go on. Another thing that I would like to share with you, for example, the first time I was on a meeting in the States, I remember they told me, Virginia, there's going to be a lunch and learn. I'm sorry, what did you say? Lunch and learn? Either you have lunch or you learn. For me, it was pretty weird. What's the lunch and learn? And I found out that was very common in the States, having a lunch and learn, so combining the two things. For me, being an Italian was very weird, because when you have lunch, you have lunch. And that's it, you don't learn anything, you just have lunch. And when you learn, it means that you speak and I listen to you and I try to learn. So for me, it was very weird. And I tried to, bring that in Italy. Terrible results. terrible results. A lunch and learn in Italy was basically a 4-hour lunch with very short time of learning. So now, of course, this is a little bit of an exaggeration, but I really want to say that there are certain things that are pretty common in some parts of the world, and are totally, not only not common, but even not very efficient, because if you want to bring something, and in some cases you may add improvement or suggestions, but on the other hand, you need also to understand that you are in a certain environment, and therefore this may play a role, in my view. So, first comment that I want to make, I made the joke about the Italians that talk with their hands. I'm a good example, because I do talk with my hand, but not all the Italians talk with their hands. So, the myth sometimes are, again, we think we have in our mind some typical stereotypal situation. For example, we know that certain categories of people are punctual. Swiss people from Switzerland are punctual. I have a very good friend of mine from Switzerland. She's the last one always. And I found out that there are many other things that are not always like that. Again, we go by, sometimes by stereotype on culture and people, and we think, okay, so you are from that country, you must be like that. Well, in some cases true, in some others not. So maybe let's be aware of how we are actually thinking and how we, let's say, start with a sort of a preconcept when we know somebody and we meet somebody from that country. It's happened to me a lot of time that, unfortunately, that I was meeting somebody and the first thing was, oh, you're from Italy, mafia, pasta, pizza, mandolino. Okay, nice to meet you. So, again, I'm not saying everybody around thinks like that or acts like that, but try for a moment to think how much your mindset is actually, maybe without even acknowledging, but it's conditioned by this false myth or this preconcept. Second thing that I wanted to say, try to be careful also on the difference into the same category. For example, again, speaking about geographical issues, do you think that a North American person, specifically from the United States, from Boston, is the same as a person from LA? Do you think they act the same way? Do you think that we can just say, well, they're from the US? Not really. They have different, actually, they have different accents, but they have also a very different way of acting. Same, let's pick on Italy again. I'm Italian, so I can pick on my own country. From the north to the south, you can have tons of differences. If you think that you know how person from Milan will act during a meeting or debate, and then you think that it's going to be the same of a person from Bari, from Palermo, probably you're wrong. On the other hand, are you sure that all the people from that geographical part are going to act that way? No, because what we said before is that there are other things that may influence. A person that has lived all of his life in a certain country, in a certain region, in a certain city, probably is more likely to be pretty much, let's say, uniformed to that type of style. But a person who has lived, for example, in different part of the world, has seen different culture, probably is more likely to be, let's say, blended with other, not only with other culture, but also with other habits. So don't forget that I said we're not robots, but humans, because one thing that, in my view, sometimes is underestimated is that we have to think that we are talking with a human person, a human being. We're not talking with a table or a chair, and therefore, before even starting to discuss about clause number 1, clause number 2, how efficient is what we propose and is much better than what the counterpart wants to have, in my view, just taking even just a few minutes. I'm not saying spending hours to make research on that person. I'm not saying study psychologists and have a second degree in psychology in order to better negotiate. No, of course. But I'm saying trying to give the importance to aspects that normally are not considered or not always considered so crucial in a negotiation or in our world, in my view, can actually be a beneficial point for everybody. And what I said is, of course, again, we're not going to be psychologists, and there's not a magic formula. If you do 2 + 2, you're going to have a better negotiation. If you have a negotiation with a Japanese company and you start studying everything about the manga, you will do great. Of course not. That's something that doesn't work. But in my view, try to be, again, open-minded always and not start with the stereotype, okay, I'm having this discussion with that person from that country. I already know that person is going to be late, that person is going to do this person is going to try to change the tape. No, you don't know, maybe because just you have a stereotype in mind that a person from that specific country will do like that. But try to, again, understand what that person actually is and all the other elements. Try to listen. And listen to the verbal, so again, the word spoken, how we spoken, and so forth, but also all the other elements, the nonverbal, the paraverbal, and try to put it in context without making any specific anthropological research, but just by trying to be informed of what's going on, trying to be, again, open-minded, respectful, and humble, because in my view, sometimes we forget to be humble, and we especially I talk also for us coming from Europe. A lot of time we tend to look at certain countries in a way like, well, but we come from Europe, you don't know. We are, we did this thing before you. Well, maybe yes, maybe we did it, maybe we did it right, maybe we did it wrong, and maybe there is room for improvement. So again, my suggestion here is maybe spend 3 minutes more before a negotiation, trying to set the parameters and trying to really understand and listen with another mindset what that person is saying and understanding also where that person comes from. And with that, again, this is not a psychology course, and I not expect that anybody will decide to move from law to psychology, but really just think about a factor that, in my view, is sometimes underestimated and means cultural difference. In my view, can help us as lawyers to avoid bigger issues in the future. And with that, if you have questions, comments, disagree or agree with me now or later, I'm always available. And I want to thank you, everybody, for the attention.